There are very few things that I enjoy more than a day at the beach, but one of those things is an excuse to wear. Today we're going to be making a beach oceanfront themed card, but more importantly, I'm going to be sharing a technique with you on how to create realistic looking three-dimensional waves directly on your cardstock. I shared this technique a couple of weeks ago over on TikTok and Instagram and got a lot of questions, so I figured it might be best to make a full video and just really get into the nitty-gritty here. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So today we're going to be making a card size that is a little bit atypical for me. I don't typically make this size or style of card. We are making what is called a slimline card, which is going to be a wider and, as you guessed it, slimmer style of card. So to start with our card base, we're going to be using an 8.5 inch by a 7-inch piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to score that right down the middle at 3.5 inches. Okay, so there we have our card base. So it's going to be 8.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and you can tell it's very thin and wide. And the reason I decided to do a card this size is we are doing a shoreline, so I wanted to do the shoreline kind of diagonal to the card and give us as much space to play with both the water and the sand. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to the side. And next I'm going to grab another piece of cardstock, and this is what we're going to actually design our front card panel on. So this is just another 8.5 by 3.5 inch piece of cardstock. And we're going to go ahead and get started on creating our shoreline. Now I think first what I want to do is create the sandy area. So I'm going to start by inking the bottom left corner of this cardstock using a little bit of Distress tea dye ink. Okay, so that looks pretty good for right now. You can see that I kind of left the edges a little bit white, so it goes from dark and then fades out to white. And that's because right here in the middle of the card is where we're going to have the most of our sea foam, or waves, if you will. So I'm going to have the brown kind of fading to white. And then when we do the water, I'm going to have the blue fading into white as well. And that's just going to help create that sea foam and wave illusion. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and grab my waffle flower sea foam stencil. And this is what we're going to use to actually create our water. You'll notice right away that the stencil is not large enough to cover the full width of the card, which is totally fine. The stencil is essentially going to create the reflections and choppiness of the ocean water. So what we're going to do is use the stencil on one side and then move it over and ink it up again. And if we have some overlap and layers of the stencil image, that's totally fine because this is supposed to be organic and natural, so it's not going to be perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and add some mint tape here just to the bottom of the cardstock, just to hold it in place while we do our stenciling. And I'll probably grab a couple other pieces to help hold the stencil in place as well. Okay, now we're ready to get to inking. I am going to be using Distress Ink Peacock Feathers, which is kind of a bluish green color. And then I'm just going to apply this directly to our stencil, but remember, I want to keep that kind of fade to white here going across the center. So I'm going to use more ink up the top, and then as I get closer to where the water meets the shoreline, I'm going to ease up on my pressure to kind of fade the color out. Okay, and let's go ahead and move the stencil over. It's kind of funny, the water looks a little bit like a giraffe pattern, so you could totally use the stencil for that as well. Okay, and there we go. We have the left side done now, and you can kind of see there where I have a little bit of overlap, but it really doesn't take away from the look at all. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to wipe off the peacock feathers from this stencil really quick. And I'm actually going to do a second layer with this stencil using another color of blue. So I'm going to take my stencil and just drop it right back over where we already stenciled, and just make sure that the pattern doesn't line up. You kind of want these to be off center and different for the second layer. And then I'm going to go over it using Mermaid Lagoon. Mermaid Lagoon is more of a bright, true blue, and using both of these colors layered together is just going to give us a little bit more depth and make the water look even more realistic. Okay, perfect. Do you see how that second layer adds just a little bit extra depth and just makes it look a little bit more realistic and less like a giraffe overall? Okay, so at this point we already have what is beginning to look like a shoreline. We have our sandy beach here with the water coming up to meet the beach. But now is where things get a little bit interesting, and we are going to make this entire image really pop and look very realistic. And that is where our handy dandy pastes come in. We are actually using a combination of two different pastes today. I am using a plain white hero paste, which is kind of a smooth, shiny white paste. And then I'm also using the Distress Grit Paste in Snowfall, which is another white paste, but it has a grit to it. To be honest, I'm not sure what the substance is that's in there. It's kind of like glitter or sand, but it just makes the paste a little bit gritty and textury, which what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use a little bit of both and combine them. That way I get kind of the perfect medium of a nice smooth foamy looking paste, but with a little bit of grit in it to make it really give that beach illusion. And when it comes to mixing paste like this, there are a couple of ways you can do this. One way that I recommend a lot of times is using an acrylic block. So if you have one of these acrylic blocks laying around, you can take your palette knife, take a little bit of each paste, and then just kind of mix them right here on your acrylic block. Scoop it up and go to town. What I've actually found works better for me, and this will work for any of you that are snackers or like yogurt, I have found that actually empty used yogurt cups are the perfect little mixing cup. Now you could also use any type of disposable cup like pudding, jello, I don't know what your snack preference is, but I use yogurt, and I'm gonna put a little bit of both of the pastes in this tub, stir it up, use it, and then you don't have to worry about cleaning it, you can just toss it out afterwards. Okay, so let's get to it, shall we? This paste always reminds me of sour cream. It looks just like sour cream in my opinion. But I'm gonna go ahead, and this is probably more than I need, but this is about maybe a walnut size of paste. And then I'm gonna go into my grit paste and get about the same size, so pretty much equal parts of both. And then I'm just gonna get to mixing. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and grab some of this with my palette knife, and I'm going to start just kind of, for lack of a better word, plopping it along this shoreline. And it's one of those things that I promise is going to look worse before it looks better. I am most concerned with just making sure that I get an even amount of paste across the shoreline. And then once I get the paste on the paper, I'm going to go back in with my palette knife and actually start kind of shaping the foam. So let's go ahead and start applying, shall we? Okay, so I think I have enough paste down for me to go ahead and start shaping, and this is where it takes a little bit of a gentle hand and a little bit of patience. Basically what I want to do is make sure I spread this paste pretty evenly across the shoreline, and then using my palette knife, I'm going to do a little bit of a scraping motion, but I'm going to be scraping towards the sand and pulling my palette knife up, and that's going to make the paste kind of give the appearance as if it is splashing against the shoreline. Okay, so you can already see that that's adding a lot of movement. It feels like the water is coming towards the beach. And then if you want to add a little more texture back in there, you can just kind of lightly take your palette knife and just pat the paste. That's going to give you a little bit of a spackle, organic looking texture. Okay, so at this point I am pretty happy with how this is looking. Let me give you a little bit more of a close-up. Do you see how that foam, I keep calling it foam, it's paste, but it looks like sea foam. Do you see how realistic that looks with it kind of crashing up onto the beach? Now, we did layer this on pretty thick, so I'm gonna go ahead and set this to the side and let it dry. It might take a little bit of time to dry. Also, with this much paste, we might get a little bit of warping of the cardstock, but don't worry about that because at the very end, once the paste is dry, we're going to glue and tape this down very firmly to our card base, so it should all flatten out in the end. So moving on to the next few elements of the card, we're going to be using a couple more Waffle Flower products from the same kind of beachy ocean release. We're going to be using the Beach Umbrella Die and Stencil set to create some beach umbrellas for our beach. And then we also have this Inquisitive Seagulls Die, which creates a large seagull and a small seagull. I think I'm going to use this and go ahead and cut out both. What I want to do is have one coming in from the bottom and one coming in from the top, and just kind of look as though they're popping into frame and looking at the recipient of the card. And then there's also a coordinating stamp set here that has these mine sentiments, which of course is a reference to Finding Nemo. And so I'm gonna also cut out a couple of speech bubbles and have them saying mine, mine, just kind of poking their heads into frame. But for starters, let's go ahead and start with the Beach Umbrella Die and Stencil. This is actually, as the name suggests, a die and stencil combo pack. So it comes with this stencil, and what you do is you actually use this stencil to ink blend a umbrella pattern, and then you can use whatever size die here to cut out the umbrella. Or you could do it the opposite. You could cut out whatever size umbrella you want out of white cardstock and then put the stencil on top of the die. Either way, I am going to do the stencil first, just because I don't really know why. That just sounds like what I want to do, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, and then I'm going to do red and white umbrellas just because I feel like that is a classic beach umbrella color combo, right? So I'm using my Candied Apple Distress ink, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and stencil this guy in. And I think I want to have a big umbrella and a small umbrella, so I'm also going to do this twice. I'm going to do one umbrella pattern up here, and then I'll move the stencil down and do another umbrella pattern. Okay, there we go. We have two umbrellas, and you can see that they are a little bit messy. For instance, I have some smudging here, and then on this one, I didn't even fully get the edges, but that's okay because I already know that I'm going to be trimming these down because, frankly, if I wanted to use one of the largest umbrellas, it's not going to fit on the card anyway. So I think that all of those little imperfections really won't matter in the grand scheme. And yes, I could have done it a little bit neater, but you know what? Craft smarter, not harder. No need to be perfect if you know you don't necessarily need it to be perfect, right? Okay, so I'm going to use this middle-sized umbrella for the top one and then the small umbrella for the bottom one. And these are a little bit tricky. There actually is a correct way to line these up because all of these little wedges are not the same size. And the way you actually line it up is if you look on the stencil, I'm not sure if you can see this because I've inked all over it now, but there is a little tiny triangle at the top. There's a little point showing that that is the top of the umbrella. And then if you look at each of the die, there will be one of the points, here it is, that has a little tiny divot in it. I don't know if you can see that. And those basically you want to line up. So that point of the umbrella you want to line up with the little divot in your die. Okay, and moment of truth, let's see if I lined this up appropriately. And I'd call that pretty good. Smudges and all, I'm not mad at that. And then let's check our smaller guy here. Whoop. Y'all, I'm being a little bit of a chaos demon here. Okay. That one's lined up pretty good too. Also some smudges, but like I said, we're not worried about that today. So I set those aside, and now let's go ahead and cut out our seagulls. Like I said, I want to do both a small one and a large one, so I'm just going to grab both of these guys. And then there's a separate die here for the little beaks here, one for the small one and one for the big one. I'm going to go ahead and cut those out of white as well. You could use a colored cardstock like orange or whatever color you want their beak to be, but I think I'm just going to color it with a marker, so I'm just going to cut that out of white. Okay, so we have cut out our seagulls. They are still stuck in the die, so I'm just prying those out real quick. Usually you can throw the die against your table and it'll pop the paper out, but for some reason that was not working with these guys. So I'm just using the end of my tweezers to poke through the holes. And then I'm gonna go ahead and color our little beaks here, just using an orange alcohol marker. This is YR3 from my Ohuhu markers. And I'm not gonna get fancy with shading or anything. I'm just gonna go straight plain Jane orange. And I'm putting this cement tape down just to protect the glass mat because Otherwise, I would have to clean my glass mat because I know that I'm going to color off of the beak. And no, you don't need to use mint tape for this. I just had a spare piece sitting by me that I used earlier for stenciling. There we go. And then I'm also going to apply just a small strip of black cardstock here behind the eyes so that they're not so soulless and scary looking. Of course, I'm just going in with a little bit of liquid glue here, and then I'll do the same thing for this guy. Whenever I used these on a TikTok video a few weeks ago, everyone thought that they were ghosts instead of seagulls, which I guess I can kind of see where they're coming from. So maybe you could use these around Halloween as well. I don't know. Okay, so we have our little black-eyed seagulls, and then just to make them look a little bit less scary, I'm going to use my white gel pen to just add some little pupils to our black eyes here. Okay, ta-da! And then last but not least, of course, we have to apply our little beaks. And then we have 2 seagulls. Honestly, this is such a simple card to put together because both that umbrella stencil and die set and these seagulls are such simple dies. So really the bulk of the work is in making those waves that I showed you how to make just a second ago. Okay, so we have 2 seagulls. We have 2 umbrellas. We are well on our way to a completed card. Before we start to actually apply these to our beach card front though, I do want to go ahead and make those speech bubbles we talked about earlier that say mine, mine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I don't actually have any speech bubble dies. So I'm going to use my Cricut Joy to actually cut out a couple of speech bubbles for me, and then we can just stamp right on top of those. And voila, just like that, we have 2 speech bubbles. We have a small one and a bigger one for our small seagull and our bigger seagull. And I decided to use a brown cardstock. This is the Cup of Joe cardstock from Hero Arts, just to tie back into our sand. And for the sentiment, I am going to emboss it in white. So before I get to embossing, I'm going to go ahead and apply some anti-static powder here, just so that we don't make a mess. And then I'm going to grab both of the Mine stamps from this coordinating stamp set here. So again, we have a bigger one and a smaller one. And we'll just line those up nice and neat with our speech bubbles. Let's pick those up, and then we'll apply some VersaMark embossing ink. Whenever I'm embossing, I always like to do at least 2 layers of ink to be on the safe side, because you can't really apply more ink after you pour the embossing powder on top. So you might as well be safe the first time around. Okay, let's go ahead and grab those and then quickly dump some embossing powder over them. And like I said, I am using white, so this is the white detail powder from Hero Arts. And we'll just sprinkle that over, and then I'll probably need to grab a pair of tweezers or something to help me grab these. There we go. Okay, we have 1 speech bubble. Let's see how the smaller one turned out. I think that that'll do. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a second dump with this one just to be on the safe side. Okay, I think that'll do. Now let's go ahead and zap these guys with the heat gun. All right, we have 2 perfect little speech bubbles here. Look, we have little pairs of everything. 2 seagulls, 2 umbrellas, 2 speech bubbles. And that is pretty much all of the elements. So let's go ahead and bring our beachfront shoreline back out. And this is not quite dry, so you know what, I'm gonna give it a little bit more time to dry. And so I'll catch you back here in just a second.
1 eternity later.
Okay, so this has dried quite a lot. It's still not completely dry, but I think it's dry enough for us to go ahead and start working with it as long as I'm careful. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. The first thing I wanna do is place our umbrellas. I think I wanna place one of them here on the corner. And I just want to see which way I can position this to get rid of the smudges as best I can here. Probably something like that. And then we'll place another one of these down here. Oh, you know what? Actually, let's add a little bit more detail to the sand first. So the stamp set that I have comes with this stamp here, which is meant to be used for a beach to add a bunch of speckled sand. I kind of feel like that's a little heavy for this particular card, but I think I have another stamp in my stash that I can use. Okay, yes, so I went and did some digging through my stash for the stamp set I was looking for and found it. It's the stamp set from Hero Arts, and there's this tiny little stamp here, this guy right here, that has the 4 dots, and that is meant to, as you can see, this is kind of a beach set here with a dog laying out at the beach. So we're just going to use these dots to add a little bit of extra detail and specks of sand across the beach, and I'm going to do that with the same tea dye ink that I used earlier. And I'm just going to kind of speckle these across the beach randomly. It's probably not going to be perfect, but that's okay. We don't necessarily need it to be perfect. Okay, there we go. Far from perfect, but it will certainly do. So let's go ahead and go back to placing our umbrellas. And I'm going to go ahead and pop these up on some foam tape, just to add a little bit of extra dimension and interest to our card here. And I'm actually going to put the foam tape down on the card first, and then put the die cut over it. I think that'll work just fine in this case. Peel the backing off, and then place our umbrella to something like so. And then let's go ahead and add some foam tape to this guy. Let me make sure I'm placing it on the side that doesn't have the smudge. Okay, perfecto. And then we're just going to cut these edges off. And this is one of my favorite part about layering die cuts off the edge of cards, is once you've cut the excess edges off, you kind of get extra die cuts. So I actually want to add a third umbrella, and I can do that without actually making a third umbrella because I'm just going to grab the leftover of this one that I just cut and layer it right here on the edge. And for this third umbrella, I'm not going to pop it up on foam tape. I'm actually just going to go ahead and tape it directly to the card panel and then layer it under this umbrella. Perfect. And then let's go ahead and once again cut off the excess. Okay, so now we're left with our beach, our umbrellas are placed, and then lastly all we got to do is add our seagulls. And like I said, I want to have them kind of popping in from the edges as if they're like popping in and looking directly at the recipient. So I think I'm going to have the larger seagull over here on the bottom left, and then we're going to have the other guy kind of poking his head here from the top. And then the way I did the speech bubbles, I did it so that the mine could be read right side up. Now I could have done the mine on the top one upside down, but I kind of wanted the recipient to be able to just read it as normal. And then I'm going to pop all 4 of these items up on foam tape as well, just so that they're on the same plane as our umbrellas here. There we have mine number 1, and then we have mine number 2. Perfect. And then let's go ahead and trim off the excess of our seagulls. I keep wanting to call these guys pigeons. I guess they're kind of like the pigeons of the sea. They're sea pigeons. But they're not pigeons. They're seagulls. And then all we really have left to do is to apply our card panel to our card base. I'm going to do that with some tape runner. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of liquid glue as well, just for some extra security. Now, just a reminder, you do want to make sure that your texture paste is completely dry before you adhere this to your card panel. Otherwise, you might get some extra additional warping while that texture paste is still drying. And to help with the placement here, I am going to pull out my Score Buddy and just make sure that I am placing this straight on at a right angle, especially anytime you're using tape. This is super helpful. If you're using liquid glue, which I just realized I forgot to put liquid glue down. You know what? That's okay. I'm going to go in here and add a little bit of extra just on this side at least. But anytime you're using tape, it's really helpful to use the Scor-Pal because tape is a little bit unforgiving. If you're using liquid glue and you don't put your panel down straight, you can kind of move it around and it's fine. But if you're using tape, you really only have one shot. You know what I mean? Okay, perfect. And then the very last thing to do here, of course, is to add the stamp on the back. I get a lot of questions about where my custom self-inking stamp is from. I will leave the information down in the description. I also have a coupon code down there if you're interested in getting one yourself. But the process is super easy. You basically design or upload your own design and then choose the type of stamp you want. I chose a self-inking stamp in this case, and they'll ship it straight to you. Super affordable, super easy, and a really great way to just customize all the backs of your cards. My stamp is a little crooked, but that's okay. Again, we're not looking for perfection here. But anyway, that is it. That's the card, guys. Thank you so much for joining me on this video. Let me know down in the comments if this was helpful, and if you're interested in seeing more content like this, please make sure you're subscribed, turn on your push notifications, and if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a comment. That really helps me out with the algorithm gods that be. But besides that, thank you again for being here, and have a marvelous, marvelous day.